I come from a country, Lebanon used to be the only majority Christian country in the Middle East. Most people don't know that. When they think of the Middle East, they think it's all Islamic countries. But Lebanon is the only majority Christian country in the Middle East. We were open-minded, we were fair. We prided ourselves on our multiculturalism. We welcomed everyone to our country, especially from the surrounding Arabic countries, because we wanted to share with them the westernization which we had created in the heart of the Middle East. Muslims used to send their children to come study in our universities because we had built the best universities in the Middle East. They graduated and worked in our economy because we had built the best economy in the Middle East, even though we did not have any oil. Lebanon was known as Paris of the Middle East, the banking capital of the Middle East. And as Christians, we focused on education. Education was very important to us. You know, we educated girls and boys, you know, no difference. We were living the good time. Unfortunately, all that began to change by the 70s because of two things. The enlargement of the Islamic population in Lebanon, because we Christians marry one spouse until death do us part. We don't have many kids. Muslims, on the other hand, are allowed to marry up to 4 wives at a time. Now, of course, not all of them do it, but enough of them do it that in our country, in Lebanon, by the 70s, the Muslims became the majority. And once they became the majority, they started massacring the Christians and killing the Christians. I remember in 1974, we stopped traveling. We used to go spend Christmas and Easter in Beirut with the rest of my family. And we stopped traveling, and I would ask my father, why aren't we going to Beirut for Christmas this year? And my daddy would say to me, well, we just decided to stay home this year. And, you know, I couldn't understand why. And later I learned is because Muslims started setting up fly-by-night checkpoints, and they would stop Christian cars traveling. And when they would get people out of the car and look at their ID and find out that this is a Christian family traveling, because in Lebanon, our religion is written on our national ID, on your driver's license, on your passport. So when they see that this is a Christian family traveling, they would get everyone out of the car and shoot them in cold blood. So we became prisoners to our homes and our cities and our communities. And that's the reason why we stopped going anywhere. By 1975, that's when the war broke out, the civil war. And the war broke out because Muslims walked into a church on a Sunday morning and began firing, shooting at Christian worshipers, and injured hundreds and killed 4 people. And that's what started out the all-out war. And it was a very difficult time for the Christians, because as the Muslims organized and now supported by the oil money flowing out of Saudi Arabia and all the Muslim countries, they wanted to basically use Lebanon as a base from which to fight Israel, kill the Jews and drive them into the sea, using Lebanese democracy and Lebanese open-mindedness and tolerance to do exactly that. And that's really when my world turned upside down and it changed. Lebanon was so multi-faith and multicultural. So we had Druze, Muslims, Christians, Protestant. The majority were Christians. We were over almost 70% Christians when we got our independence in the 40s. But because of the way Muslims multiply, you know, with the multiple wives and multiple kids, in 30 years, they became the majority. And when we got our independence from France and Lebanon, because we are, you know, Judeo-Christians, you know, come from Judeo-Christian culture, we're very fair. So we made sure we divided the government to make sure that Muslims have representation. So the president of the country was Christian, the prime minister was a Muslim, the prime minister, you know, the secretary of state. We had different assignments for different religions. But the Muslims became the majority. And once they became the majority, they were no longer tolerant of the people who took them in and accepted them and included them in the country. They felt they were not a part of the country. They felt they were a part of the Islamic Ummah or the Islamic nation. So when they turned against their brethren Christians who lived in the same country, and Jews, but specifically the Christians, they began massacring us in large numbers because they thought we are in power now and therefore we set the rules on how things should be. And that's really what drove the country into war. We had the problem controlled when it was only the Christians in Lebanon and the Muslims in Lebanon. But what aggravated the situation was the influx of the Palestinians out of Jordan, who came to Lebanon. And Lebanon was the only country who took them in. Because we were the only country that accepted the third wave of Palestinian refugees, while the Muslim countries did not want them. And that's what really changed the situation. That's what tipped the scale. My life turned upside down in 1975. That's when my 9/11 happened to me. When radical Islamists bombed my home, burning it down, burying me under the rubble, wounded as they shouted, Allahu Akbar. I ended up in a hospital for 2.5 months. And as I laid in a hospital bed, hooked up to IVs in both arms, going from one surgery to another, I would ask my parents, why did they do this to us? And my father would tell me, because we are Christians, the Muslims consider us infidels and they want to kill us. So I learned since I was a 10-year-old little girl that I am wanted dead simply because I was born into the Christian faith and lived in a Christian town. When we left, after 2.5 months, I left the hospital and came back home, but my home was no longer the home I left. I ended up living in a bomb shelter underground, without electricity, without water, and very little food. And to get some food, we would crawl out under the out of the bomb shelter under the bombs and dig out different dandelions and different vegetation that grew around our bomb shelter because it was the only greenery we had to eat. To get some water, we would crawl to a nearby spring to fetch some water. And because we were surrounded by Islamic snipers shooting at us, every time we left to go to the spring to get water, we would say our last goodbyes because we did not know if we're going to come back alive or dead, just to get a drink of water. And then when we would get to the spring, my mother had to use her stocking on top of the gallon of water to catch all the dirt and all the junk so we can drink the water. And this became my existence. And we heard those who fled, we were surrounded to be slaughtered by Islamic radicals, by the Muslim, our own neighbors who wanted to kill us. And we heard stories of those who were massacred in the rest of Lebanon, what the Muslims were doing to the Christians. The Muslims would surround Christian cities and trap the people inside. They would walk into bomb shelters. They would find a mother and a baby and a father hiding with a little baby in a bomb shelter. They would take the baby, tie one leg of the baby to the mother and another one to the father, and pull the parents apart, splitting the child in half. They committed monstrosities that were seldom reported in Western media. And then we heard what they were doing to the rest of the Christians. I mean, the monstrosities they committed, they would take Christians, for example, they would target Christian men, and not only they would slit a Christian man's throat, but then they will cut a cross on his chest. And then in many areas, sometimes they would crucify the men and put honey on their chests so they would be bitten by bees, stung by bees as they died. Most horrific crimes. I think the biggest disservice the American media did to the American public is not show the beheading of Daniel Pearl and Nick Berg. I think the American public needed to see the barbarism coming our way. And this is how we lived. And those Christians who fled the massacres and came to hide in our town because we were the last Christian enclave left in South Lebanon. And they would tell us these stories. And when these Christians were still there and the Muslims would come into their towns to do the massacres, and the Christians would tell them, you can't massacre us. We fought for your right. We marched with you. We demonstrated for you. You know, you can't kill us. We were on your side. And the Muslims would tell them, you were nothing more than a filthy infidel. You know, what difference are you from those other people? But it was too late for people to wake up, and those who escaped, by the time they get to our town, it was too late to change anything. This went on for 7 years. I ended up living in that bomb shelter for 7 years of my life, from the age of 10 till the age of 17, robbed of my youth. When you are in that situation, only God is the only person who's by your side. We were forsaken by the whole world, by the whole world. I remember when we went into our bomb shelter, we thought it's going to be a 2 weeks ordeal. And then my daddy used to say, oh, all the big Christian countries in the world are going to come see what's happening to the Christians in Lebanon and save the Christians. America's going to come. Britain is going to come. Canada's going to come. France is going to come. And we waited and we waited and nobody came. I remember 3 years into our ordeal. I was 13 years old and we had been living in the bomb shelter for 3 years now. One of our Christian militia stopped by. He said, Brigitte, I just want you to know that we heard a lot of chatter on the radios and we know that we're going to be attacked tonight. The Muslims are launching a major attack around our town. And he said, if I don't see you tomorrow, I want to wish you a merciful death. And he gave me a big hug and left. And I remember crying, sobbing, begging my mother, I don't want to die. I'm only 13 years old. And there was nothing my mother could say to me. And we sat in the bomb shelter and my father started reading from Psalm, I shall walk into the valley of death and fear no evil, for thou art with me. And my parents said to me, when they come to slaughter us tonight, we'll create a distraction. You just run towards Israel and never look back. Because we lived on the border with Israel and we knew if we run to the Jews and beg for help, the Jews are going to help us. You know, we have more shared values with them than we had with the Muslims. And thank God I did not have to make that decision that night, because that's the night when Israel came in physically into Lebanon and kicked out the Muslims away from our area and set up artillery bases around our town so they can protect us from the Islamists who wanted to slaughter us. So when you are in that, when you hit that level, when you are in utter desperation, when you know the whole world has forsaken you, when you know you cannot help yourself, the only thing you have to depend on is God and the grace of God. That's when you sit on your knee and you say, Jesus, I have nowhere else to turn but you. Nowhere else to turn. And that's truly when you realize how faith is so important in your life. No matter how sometimes people go through life thinking, you know, faith doesn't matter. It's amazing how much they realize how much faith matters. When you get to that point, when you face death on a daily basis, you realize the only thing I have is faith. And it is only the grace of God. It's only that love of God. It's only that hope that not only God is with you and He would not allow anything to happen to you unless it is meant to happen. And even when that happens, you think, I will go to a better place. There is peace in my life no matter what. And I will get there as long as I know that I'm strong in my faith. And that's really when you are in that situation, hope and faith is the only thing that can get you through. That's the only thing that got me through my years in the bomb shelter. Every Sunday, it was Sunday, we didn't have obviously a church service, it was only the three of us, but we would have like our own ritual, our prayers, you know, where we would discuss the Bible and open up the Bible and we would read from the Bible. And but then again, that was our daily thing. I mean, my daddy, we had our Bible with us in the bomb shelter, and my daddy had his prayer book, you know, and that's all he did all day long. He would read in his prayer books. I still have my daddy's prayer book now. It is so old, so browned out. Every page almost fallen apart. I have it all taped, you know, so I can preserve it, but that was the only thing that we had, prayers. And I remember when we would have ceasefire, come hell or high water, we were going to go to church, and it would be snowing, and my parents would drag me around, especially as a child, you know. It's like, do we really have to go to church? Don't you see the snow outside? And they said, we have a ceasefire for 2 hours, we're going to church. And I remember many nights having to, or many services, having to leave church because the militia would run into the church service and say, shells are going to start falling in 15 minutes. We just heard on the radios that we're going to be attacked. Everybody would scatter. The pastor would wrap up the church service so fast, and everybody would run back to their homes trying to make it before the bombs started falling. And I remember a few times where we were trapped in the church as the bombs started to fall without notice. And, you know, the priest would continue the church service, trying to continue the church service, thinking, we are in church, nothing's going to happen. But then the bombs would fall really, very, very, very close. I remember one fell like right behind the church, and the pastor said, okay, to the pastor's house, which is right next to the church, and we all run there and hide, in his bomb shelter. I remember one time we were like 30 of us in his bomb shelter, and we sat there for like 4 hours waiting for, the bombing to stop. And one time he continued the service in the bomb shelter. That's what was my childhood. I never celebrated my birthdays because I never thought I'd live to see the next birthday. I never thought I'd live to be 20. And I remember every time I would celebrate my birthday, or when my birthday would get closer, and I would pray to God that I would make it to see that birthday, and it will come. And it was only by the grace of God that I realized we were living every day. There was nothing. We lost complete control over our lives, and the only way we stayed alive is by God's hand on our life. Dressing in my burial dress at the age of 13. Very few people know what that experience is like, if any. Very few people around the world. As a child, knowing that I'm dressing to face my God. It's the end. I'm going to die. And it teaches you to learn to live repenting for anything you do in life on a daily basis, because you never know when you're going to face your Creator. It's a really good experience, especially for a teenager. But I remember so many times. I remember when my mother was wounded, and we had to take her to Israeli hospital for treatment. And when she was wounded and the bombs were falling, and the only way I can actually even get help to take us anywhere, because we lived on the edge of town, was for me to go stand on the side of the road waiting for a military armor to pass by that I can wave down and stop. And I remember walking out under the bombs, leaving my wounded mother bleeding in the bomb shelter and my father, who's old and deaf. And here I was, a young 17-year-old, and walking out under the bombs, and I said, God, please keep me alive, because if I died, there will be no one to help my parents. And I remember standing against the wall, waiting for cars to pass by or a tank to pass by that I can wave. And I remember a few cars passing by without seeing me, flying, because the bombs were falling so fast. And I'm standing and shouting, and and they didn't hear me. And finally, I remember one bomb fell so close to me that it just picked me up and threw me against the wall. I banged my head. My head is bleeding now. And I'm thinking, God, is this the end? Is this the end? Show me that you are there. Help me. Show me if you are real. You have got to do a miracle here. I've got to save my mother. And all of a sudden, the same car that I thought had passed, that didn't hear me, comes back, because the car that drove so fast dropped the soldier to go up to the military base above my house, and they thought they heard something. So the car stops back, and they hear me. That's when I started screaming, and they heard me, and they ended up taking my mom to the hospital. And I remember sitting in that car thinking, thank you, God, because it felt, if there was ever a time when I can point, and I have many times, but that was one of the times that I can point to where I know God heard me, and made a difference in my life. It's much easier now as an adult, when you become mature, and you are mature in your faith, and you have seen the hand of God in your life for decades. I'm in my 40s, so I have seen how God spared my life. I never thought I'd live to see 20, nor 30, let alone 40, and now I'm 48 and I'm still alive, and I celebrate every day as if it's a gift, it's a miracle.
Good. Very good.
Thank you. Not shabby for 48, and I'm proud of it. But I'm so grateful for my life. But when I was younger, I remember one time I sat on my daddy's lap. He was in his wheelchair, and I said, I hate them. I cannot believe this happened to our life. How can they do this? How can God allow these things to happen to our life? I used to think to myself, God, why don't you go pick on the murderers and the serial killers and the rapists and people who really do bad things, instead of us who served you, who are so faithful, who never hurt anybody, who abide, by your laws, by the Bible. And I could never understand. And as a teenager, of course, I hated. It wouldn't be normal. I wouldn't be normal to hate my enemy. But I learned very quickly as I got into, and my father, I remember one time saying, I just hate those people. And my daddy said to me, he held me, he said, I never ever want to hear you say that word. He said, I did not raise you as a Christian to hate. And that really stuck with me. I was 22 years old at that time. And it made me realize that hatred destroys only the hater. it's not affecting the people who did anything to me. I don't even know them. I don't even know their names. I was just casting this resentment, this anger and hatred is the side effect of pain. And the less you move away from pain, or the learn to cope with the pain, the less hatred and resentment you have. Because then you're able to focus on, how can I forgive? Because forgiveness becomes a part of the healing that heals the pain. And once you understand that concept, that the only way you can heal is to forgive, forgiveness becomes medicine. And when you know that that is the secret to your own recovery and healing, that's when you begin down the road to just let go and pray for them that whatever wrong that they did, that God will forgive them because they did not know what they were doing. Because if they killed or tried to kill, I feel sorry for them because they don't know the love of God. And they do not know the love of a God who gave His only begotten Son to die for our sins. And if God is able to love us that much, and if Jesus is able to love us that much, how much more we should love each other, or be obliged to love each other, and be willing to love each other and forgive each other. So once I learned to forgive those who hurt me and pray for them, that they will experience the love and peace that I have. Because look at my life. I didn't let the shackles of my background and my pain ruin me for the future. It actually allowed me to be so free to speak about love and how to love your enemy, how to pray for your enemy. It does not mean I'm not wise in learning how to protect myself from my enemy. I came to America. I married an American who was a war correspondent while I was working in Jerusalem as a news anchor, and this is how I ended up in this country. We got married in Jerusalem, had our first baby in Jerusalem, and then we came to the United States. And I thought I left all the crazies behind me. I left all those radicals behind me. I'm in America now. I'm going to have a brand new life. It's going to be so wonderful. I have made it to the promised land. And we did. My husband and I started our own little TV production company and a little business, and you know, we had a second child, so we lived in a beautiful little home with the picket fence. I mean, we had the American dream. And September 11th turned my life upside down. September 11th reminded me that the crazies I left behind have followed me here to the United States. And that's when I thought to myself, I mean, after September 11th, I laid on my family room couch for 7 days. I was devastated. I was frustrated. All of a sudden, all this pain came to the surface. All this agony, all the memories that I tried to suppress and forget about came to the surface. When I was watching the images of 9/11, as we all did on 9/11, we sat in front of our TV screens feeling so helpless, so frustrated, so in pain, so in agony, that how could people do this, something like this to us? And I remember watching the images of people being pulled from under the rubble, or parents screaming for their loved one, for their children, screaming their children's names, holding pictures. I remember people running around with pictures of their loved ones saying, have you seen this person? Have you seen this person? And watching the smoke come out of the buildings. And for me, it reminded me of when I was wounded, when I was trapped under a wall. I could smell the black powder. I can feel the heat of the fire around me. I drank my own blood. I was wounded in my arm. My arm was over my face. The blood was in my eyes and my lips, and I could not I remember the taste of my blood as I bled, drinking my blood. I remember hearing the voices of my parents screaming to me. So when I watched the images of September 11th, it did something to me different. It affected me differently than a lot of people who have not gone through that experience of a terrorist attack of that magnitude. And I laid on the couch thinking, what can I do? My daughter walked home on September 11th. I have two daughters. And she was around my age when this happened. And when I was wounded, she was 10 years old. And she walked home and she was looking at the TV screens and she said to me, Mommy, why did they do this to us? And I found myself looking at my daughter and repeating to her exactly what my daddy told me in Lebanon back 30 years ago. They hate us because they consider us infidels, and they want to kill us because we are Christians. Here we were, 2 generations apart, 2 continents apart. I was a young Lebanese girl when I was her age, when I was wounded, who spoke the Arabic language, had a Lebanese passport. She's a young American girl who speaks the English language, has an American passport. 8,000 miles apart, 2 continents apart. Yet I found myself repeating to my daughter exactly what my daddy told me. That's the day that I became an activist. That's the day, that was my defining moment. September 11th was a defining moment for our country. That moment was a defining moment for me. That's the day I swore I will do everything I can in my power to make sure that my daughter will never ever look into her child's eyes and repeat to him or to her what my daddy told me and what I had to tell her. That's the day I was reborn as an activist. And I started thinking, what can I do to make a difference for my country? And I'm the type of person that I believe every single one of us in life has a purpose, has a destiny to fulfill. We are here for a reason, for a season, for a purpose. And we go through trials and tribulations in life, and we do not know, why did God allow that to happen to me? Why did God allow that horrible, horrible, bad thing to happen to me, no matter where we are in life? And when I look back at everything that I've been through, that day I knew, when I fasted and I prayed, that the reason why God allowed me to go through the pain, the agony, being raised in war, is because God was preparing me to make a difference for my country here in America. The dream that became my address. I never thought I'd live in my dream, but I am. Yet the Islamists who ruined my life in Lebanon have followed me here. And I realized, this is my purpose. I have found my purpose. I can mobilize people. I can speak from personal experience. I not only am a terrorism analyst who can talk about terrorism from an intellectual point of view, but I'm a